Hello there, this is Dr. Kramer, and this is part three of the three-part early medieval literature, epics, and Beowulf series of lectures for Unit 2. Today we're going to talk about specific features in Beowulf. Early British literature began as oral poetry, but it came to be written down once Christianity became more widespread among those of Germanic heritage. The Venerable Bede wrote some of the earliest works, composing 40 or so books of theology and history. Our anthology contains some segments from Historia Ecclesiastica Gentis Anglorum, or the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, which he finished in 731. By the way, it is in this work that the term AD, or Anno Domini, first became to be used for dating history. Bede wrote in Latin, which was the language of the church, but King Alfred, who reigned 871 to 899, encouraged writing in the vernacular English. King Alfred was a great patron of literature, and it was during his reign that the Anglo-Saxon chronicles were begun. This historical record, which exists today in 7 surviving manuscripts of varying lengths and completeness, covers material from Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica and goes through the Norman invasion all the way to AD 1154. Early medieval literature includes works of history like the Anglo-Saxon chronicles in Old English and Bede's Historia in Latin, as well as poetry like Beowulf and Judith, which is another long poem found in your anthology, and even riddles, which are also included in your anthology, so I encourage you to check those out if you're interested. In terms of poetry, Old English literature has some particularities that are different from what we expect from poetry today. Many of you are familiar with unrhymed poetry, or blank verse, or free verse, but you may have studied poems in the past that rhymed, either with a regular rhyme scheme or an irregular one. Many of today's popular songs in all genres of music still feature rhyming prominently. The early English, however, used alliteration instead. You can find formal definitions, by the way, for literary terms in the back of each volume of the Norton Anthology of English Literature, which in Volume A begins on page A11, which is in the very back. Alliteration, as you may or may not remember from earlier schooling, refers to the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of a word. So there's the old nursery rhyme, Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, with the P, repetition. And then there are many, many examples in Beowulf, like, quote, the storied leader sat stricken and helpless, line 130, which is a repetition of the S sound. The poem in Old English would have made use of alliteration, as songs today might make use of end rhyme. The translator of the version in your anthology, who's named Seamus Haney, is himself a poet, and he tries to include alliteration whenever possible to retain the meaning, so be on the lookout for it as you read. Beowulf is a folk epic, having circulated orally for some time before it was written down. We don't have time in this summer course to read the selection from Bede's Ecclesiastica Historia, though you can certainly look it up in Volume A if you'd like. But in one section of this story, or this work, Bede mentions that the monks at Whitby in northern England would sit around reading and creating verses as they passed around a harp. Several works from the early medieval times mention characters that appear in Beowulf, so we know that it was a widely familiar tale. The written version imposes some Christian imagery and sensibilities backward onto the events in the epic. Historians have been able to date some of the events referenced in Beowulf, like the death of Hygelac, Beowulf's uncle, which is discussed in this poem and which history records occurring around AD 520. This time period predates the widespread acceptance of Christianity by the Anglo-Saxons and Jutes. Most scholars date the written version, what you see in your textbook, to between AD 680 and 800, with many setting AD 750 as the probable date. Beowulf was probably composed in a monastery, since only monks and nuns really would have been literate at this time. We only have one manuscript of Beowulf left to us right now, and that one suffered some fire damage. You'll see in the story when the translator will give you a note, and he says something like, this part is kind of damaged so much that I can't even tell what's going on, so we're just going to skip. So be on the lookout for that. The story is Swedish in origin, And the events take place kind of in modern-day Sweden and the island of Zealand in East Denmark. That's where Hrothgar's hall probably was. So you see here on this little map kind of where the different tribes, Germanic tribes, were settling at the time, with the Jutes and the Angles being some of the tribes that migrated to England. In around 575, the Swedes entered Gateland, and remember Beowulf is a gate, so that's how kind of the Swedes got mixed up in it, and then the Gates brought Beowulf to England with them when they visited. I'd now like to talk about the language in Beowulf. In addition to its alliteration, discussed on the previous slide, Beowulf features many figures of speech and literary devices that you'll want to look out for. First, the poem contains synecdoche, which is where you use a part of something to describe the whole. So an example from regular English would be all hands on deck, where you're talking about hands, but you don't just want people's hands on the deck, you want their whole bodies, but you're referring to a person as a hand. An example from Beowulf would be, for example, in line 32, where it says, a ring-whirled prow rode in the harbor. So it talks about a prow, which is the front part of a ship, but it's really meaning the whole ship. The Beowulf poet also implies metonymy, which is quite similar to synecdoche. Metonymy means using a thing associated with the concept to stand in for a larger concept. So the proverb, the pen is mightier than the sword, there are two metonymies. The pen stands in for the written word, and the sword stands in for military aggression. An example from Beowulf occurs in line 1532, when the poet refers to Beowulf's sword as, quote, the keen inlaid whirl-looped patterned steel, close quote. So instead of calling it a sword, he calls it steel. Here's a random aside, and I've got a picture here to kind of help with this explanation. This line indicates that Beowulf had a sword of Damascene, or Damascus steel, distinguished by its mottled appearance and extreme sharpness. So you'll see several references in Beowulf to this kind of patterned steel, and that's what it's talking about. Once the ability to forge this kind of steel was lost, it was never regained. So if you're a Game of Thrones fan, think of the highly prized Valyrian steel swords, another lost art of metalworking from an ancient civilization. Another popular English literary device found in Beowulf is something called variation, or as our textbook calls it on page 9, parallel and appositive expression. In other words, the Beowulf poet will call a character or an object something and then proceed to redescribe it. For example, one might say, I spoke to my sweetheart, my girlfriend of the past 6 months, where sweetheart and girlfriend are the same person. If you're the Beowulf poet, you say things like, so the noble prince proceeded undismayed up fells and screes, along narrow footpaths and ways where they were forced into a single file. This is from lines 1408 through 1410. A path where you have to walk single file is of course narrow. But this isn't word padding like when you've run out of ideas and are desperate to reach the minimum word count for an essay. Variation is a literary device beloved of the English poets. Litotes is a dramatic understatement and another literary device used in Beowulf. You usually indicate a litotes by denying its opposite. For instance, if I said, you would not be wrong if you thought I looked a bit tired, that could be a litotes if I'd spent a sleepless night and had major dark circles and bloodshot eyes. Beowulf includes lines like, that is no good place, line 1372, meaning it's a very, very bad place indeed, that serve as examples of litotes. Another literary device found in Beowulf is irony, mainly dramatic irony, which is the kind of irony where the audience knows something that the characters in the story do not. The main place where this occurs in Beowulf is when the Danes hanging out on the shore of the monstrous lake see blood rising to the surface of the water and assume that Beowulf has been killed by Grendel's mother, when we, the audience, know that the opposite has happened. This scene occurs in lines 1600 through 1605. The final two literary elements to look for in Beowulf are kennings and epithets. Kennings are particular features in Old Germanic, Old Norse, and Old English poetry. All of these, of course, are linguistically related. In a kenning, the poet uses two nouns as a compound word to replace a common noun. The most common one in Beowulf is Whale Road for ocean, but Beowulf's name itself is a kenning. Beo means wolf, Beo means bee, and wolf, where we get the word wolf, means enemy. So what is a bee enemy? A bear. Hence Beowulf means bear. You'll be able to spot the kennings fairly easily throughout the poem. One of my favorite is in line 258, where Beowulf, who is yet unnamed, quote, unlocked his word hoard, close quote, i.e. opened his mouth to speak. So the poet describes his mouth as a hoard full of words waiting to burst out, and that the words are treasures is the implication. Finally, we have epithets, a feature Beowulf shares with Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Epithets are descriptive phrases given before or after someone's name. For example, you can observe people referred to as a ring giver, or a winner of fights, or when someone's genealogy is given after their name, that's also an epithet. Lines 1651 through 1652 has several of these. Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow, spoke. So, son of Halfdane, prince of the Shieldings, etc., etc. As you read, mark down a few kennings and epithets. I want to pause in the in-depth discussion of Beowulf's features here to let you listen to the opening lines of the poem as it would have been heard in its day. So, in a minute, I'm going to play lines 1 through 11 in Old English. Now, they'll show you kind of the subtitles as you go. The translation is a little bit different than the Seamus Heaney translation. This translation is actually by J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Hobbit. So let's listen in to what it would have sounded like and see if you can understand anything.
What we gardena in year dagum, thaid keninga thrum je frunnen, hoe adalingas ellen fremedon, of chill shaving shalana threatum, monium maigdum, meer settle off there, eis or airlas, sid an airest wert, feierschaft funden, he as vrouwerie bad werks onder wolken, wert met dem thag, or that him eichwilch daar se tendere, overgrundrade huren, schulde, gom and yelden. That was gold kuning.
All right. Well, what do you think? Could you understand any of the reading? What about that last line, which basically said, that was a great king? Some say that students can pick up Old English in just a semester of diligent study, but I've never tested this theory. You can certainly hear the similarities to modern-day German, Dutch, or another Germanic language if you've ever been around one of those languages. I'd now like to talk about the characters in Beowulf. The Beowulf poet sets up several characters in opposition to each other in a literary technique known as doppelganger, a German word that means double walker. You could also think of a doppelganger as an alter ego, an evil twin, a mirror image. You could make the argument that superheroes' normal personas, like Bruce Banner, the Incredible Hulk, or Diana Prince for Wonder Woman, are doppelgangers. But in Beowulf, we see characters set in opposition to each other, with the two most obvious being Beowulf compared to Grendel. In this set of opposites, the poet is exploring what it means to be a warrior. In Beowulf, we see the positive aspects of the warrior, and in Grendel, the poet represents the wrong way to be a fighter. We can argue that the Beowulf poet is creating a doppelganger here with Beowulf and Grendel, in part because of these opposing characteristics, and in part because he blurs the pronouns during the battle scene between the two. For instance, it seems like when the poet says things like, fingers were bursting in line 759, he is referring to both of the contenders at the same time. Beowulf is the ideal warrior of his culture, always in a company of some sort, although he generally, except for the last battle with the dragon, does his fighting alone. Grendel, however, is known as a lone walker. Where Beowulf is generally well received by his peers and happy, Grendel is spurned and joyless. Line 720. Beowulf also does his killing during the day, unless he is defending Heorot from Grendel, while Grendel does his killing during the night, wreaking havoc at night under the cover of darkness. Beowulf has weapons. Some are even named like Hrunting, but Beowulf fights with no weapons. In fact, in order to fight Grendel, Beowulf disarms himself of his technological advantages. This, by the way, underscores how the two are doppelgangers, as Beowulf, by fighting at night and without weapons, makes himself more like Grendel. Where Beowulf is known to have the strength of 30 men, Grendel has killed 30 men in Hrothgar's hall. And while Beowulf is described in a kenning as a son of Ecgtheow, Grendel has no father. A final difference between Beowulf and Grendel is boasting. Beowulf is quite good at boasting. You can see his mead hall bravado hours before his battle. This begins in line 436. But the Beowulf poet tells us that Grendel can't boast. It may seem weird to us in modern times that boasting is associated with the good character. After all, no one likes people who are bragging too much, or as my kids would say, flexing. However, boasting meant something different in the warrior culture of this time period. It was more like a promise than empty words meant to inflate an ego and impress those around you. When Beowulf goes off on how he will successfully defeat Grendel, he is not just drawing attention to himself, he is committing to get the job done. Grendel, who can't boast, is therefore not a proper warrior because he can't make promises. The things that make Beowulf a good warrior for his culture, good standing with his peers, weapons, boasting, a pedigree, are out of reach for Grendel because he lives alone and has no companions. His only kinsman is his mother. Let's talk about Grendel's mother. Despite her monstrosity, she functions much more like a member of Old English society than her son Grendel. Grendel indiscriminately killed warriors in Hrothgar's hall for no other apparent reason than the noise their feasting created, another indication of his rejection of culture. And he does not offer to pay the Were Guild or blood price for killing someone during this time period. Grendel's mother, on the other hand, operates under the premises of a blood feud. In the world of Beowulf, quote, if one of his kinsmen had been slain, a man had a moral obligation either to kill the slayer or to enact payment of Were Guild or man price in compensation, close quote. That's from Norton, page 39. We see Grendel's mother kill Hrothgar's favorite counselor, Ashera, when she enters the hall as retribution for Beowulf killing her son. When Beowulf dies down into the lake of monsters and enters her hall, he is only doing what Grendel's mother had done when she entered Hrothgar's hall. This seems like more of an honorable fight in terms of the warrior code than Beowulf's fight with Grendel. The place where Grendel's mother, like her son, breaks the cultural norms is in her gender. In this society, women were peace weavers and cupbearers. We see Hrothgar's wife, Wealhtheow, and Hygg, Queen of the Gates, behaving in ways that soothe and temper their husbands and their warriors. Beginning on line 1070, the poem within a poem relates the story of Hildebur, a queen who is the daughter of the Danish king Hauk, but the wife of the Frisian king Finn. Their marriage was supposed to bring peace between the Danes and the Frisians, but war broke out again, and Hildebur lost her brother, son, and husband in the fighting. This peace-weaving tale, or irony, if you will, is told through a scop, or bard, during the feast celebrating Beowulf's defeat of Grendel, and just before Grendel's mother comes to wreak havoc in Heorot again, underscoring the inhumanity of the female monster for her failure to weave peace. Finally, I'd like to leave you with a few questions to ponder while you read Beowulf, which may help you develop your own discussion posts. The thing that struck me the most this time I read the poem was its commentary on kingship, or more broadly, leadership. What makes for a good king in the world of the poem? What makes for a bad ruler? What is the poet's commentary, obvious or subtle, on Hrothgar and Beowulf, or even Hygelac, or the other kings mentioned only in reference? Another thing is the events of the poem occurred before Germanic tribes migrated en masse to England, or Scandinavian culture for that matter, was Christianized. And yet the Beowulf poet inserts the Christian God into the narrative. How is Christianity operating in the poem? Another thing to look for, especially in the scene as Beowulf travels to the Lake of Monsters, is how the landscape reflects the plot or personalities of the characters. Be sure to allow enough time to read this poem. It may take several days. I recommend reading with a pen in hand, annotating as you go. What you annotate is entirely up to you. You might want to note examples of literary devices as you run across them, as well as character and theme aspects discussed in this lecture, but each of you will find different aspects that jump out at you that you'll want to note. And these are the kinds of things that you want to go back and look at before you write your discussion post, because you need to make sure you have at least 3 quotes. When I read, for example, I have a scholarly interest in how marriage is portrayed in literature, so I personally annotated material related to that interest as I read. I'm going to leave you finally with some links. This first link is an 11-minute summary of the major plot points and themes in Beowulf, along with the BBC video here about the archaeological excavation at Sutton Hoo at the end of the slideshow. So you see this here. I'll also put it on the early medieval instruction page, and it will also be at the end of the lecture notes if you want to access those notes from Canvas separately. The speaker for the Classic Summarized, that first link video, is a little irreverent, so you've been forewarned. There's nothing terrible, but just some PG-13 type language, and she speaks rather quickly. However, the material is really good, and you may find that having a summary of the poem's actions is helpful before you read the poem for yourself, because of its elevated epic language. The second link, about the Sutton Hoo, is about the site containing a burial hoard full of artifacts from Beowulf's time period. So if you're having trouble picturing what the world of Beowulf might have looked like, you might find this video helpful. These are completely optional, by the way, but they may help you understand this long ago culture and literature a little better. By the way, if you're looking for a new show to binge watch, you have reached the end of the Netflix during COVID-19. Let me recommend the Last Kingdom series, which deals with England during the time period of King Alfred the Great. It's an adaptation of Bernard Cornwell's The Saxon Stories series of novels. The main character is a character that has both early British influence on him, the Germanic tribe influence, but also Christianity influences, as well as influence of the Danes, or what you might know as the Vikings. This was a time period during King Alfred's reign where England was being invaded and attacked by Vikings on a regular basis. So you may find that series interesting if Beowulf and this lecture series has interested you. Thank you so much for sticking with these 3 videos. I look forward to reading your discussion posts.